Today, we're going to be discussing liberal democracy, and we had touched on it briefly in the semester. And within the context of democracy, when we talked about democracy, we touched on the different types of democratic rule. Today, we are focusing on liberal democracy. We want to understand what this type of political system is. Now, this is practiced by many countries today. So, we'll begin by looking at two key ideas, which is liberalism and democracy. Because for us to understand liberal democracy, students, we have to understand what liberalism means or liberal means and what democracy is. Now, again, we already have the foundation for democracy coming from our discussions earlier in the semester, but it's good to take a look at that again to refresh our memories on this. Now, liberalism refers to the belief in individual liberty. Now, please take note of this, students, because there are a lot of things happening here in this definition, and it's important for us to understand each item and to contextualize those items within the larger context of liberal democracy. It refers to the belief in individual liberty. Now, what is individual liberty? That is, you as an individual, you have liberty that are prescribed and documented and stated in the Constitution. This is very critical because if you are a member of that society, you have liberty. And that liberty cannot be taken away from you. It's not a privilege, it's a right. Right, so we made the distinction between a privilege and a right in a previous lecture, and we want to ensure that those rights are understood and those rights cannot be taken. So, for example, your right to existence as a human being cannot be taken away from you. If it's taken away from you needlessly, well, your family has a recourse. You have a right to food and shelter. You have a right to education, right to health, good health care, right to freedom of religion and freedom of worship and so forth. Right? So individual liberties, and those liberties are very enshrined in the Constitution. Right? So it says equality before the law. And of course, we know this is not, when it comes to the practicality of this, it's not always the same. We understand that other variables come to play, like race and ethnicity and the sex of the person involved and so forth. All of those things have a bearing on how people are treated in the courtroom. But within the context of the law and in the eyes of the law, everyone is equal. Now, the application of that law might be different because human beings, as we know, are inherently biased, inherently not objective. As we know, humans have the tendency not to be objective. Doesn't mean that they cannot be objective. They can be objective, but there's always that possibility that they may not be objective based on, once again, a number of factors. When we talk about liberalism, students, individual liberty, equality before the law, and limited government intervention in the economy and personal lives. And that's why, for example, in liberal democracy, they allow individuals to make choices, personal choices on how they want to lead their lives, on issues of abortion, for example, and limited involvement in the economy. Let the individual decide in terms of their purchasing power. Let the market forces decide what happens in the economy. The government should not be dictating what happens in the economy, right? As part of the overall concept of liberalism, limited involvement. So the government sets policies, of course, economic policies that have impact on the economy, but they don't overly get involved in the economy. They allow market forces to determine the economy. They allow individuals to, when they're buying and selling in the supply and demand ecosystem, to determine the economy. That's liberalism. Once again, characterized by individual liberty, equality before the law, and limited intervention in the economy, and of course, in the personal lives of the citizens. Citizens get to decide how they lead their lives within the context of the law, within the ambit of the law. They get to decide how to conduct their own affairs. Now we move to democracy. What does that mean? It means rule by the people. And the people here are the citizens, right? So let's put that here. Rule by the citizens, either directly or through elected representatives. Now, we talked about this earlier, like I said before. In a democratic setting, typically citizens elect a representative, in theory, will go to the parliament and be the person that speaks for that community or that district or that constituency. And that is democracy. because that person is representing a group of people. Now, it's not possible for everyone to represent themselves and to go into parliament in a huge country, for example. So they need representation. It means rule by the people, either directly or through elected representatives. It's a system where citizens have the power to influence decisions that affect their lives. How do you, as a citizen, have the power to influence decisions that affect your life? For example, economic policies. Do you have a say in the interest rate, how that is adjusted? Do you have a say on policies that impact your life for the country to go to war? Do you have a say in that? And how do you have a say in that? If you say yes, and how is it? Through your representatives, of course. And sometimes you can directly, as a citizen, reach out to the government and write letters to your representatives, write letters to the president, write letters to a parliament, for example. Citizens have the power because they elected those representatives. They tell them what to do. Important for us to understand this concept of democracy, how it plays out. You have the power to tell the government what to do collectively, and the government has to listen because there is accountability, students. If they don't listen, what happens? Of course, they lose the election, right? They lose the next election. And in some extreme cases, representatives can be impeached and they're kicked out of office before the term is over. All of those things are available to citizens. So it's a system where citizens have the power to influence decisions that affect their lives, often through voting. Please take note of this, students. The voting power is the most powerful tool that is available to citizens. So let's put that here. So the voting power, the most powerful tool in a democratic setting. The government and elected representatives are not pulling their weight. They are not representing the people. The people have the right to go to the polling station and say, we need a new government. Now, assuming that it's a free and fair election, there is no interference in the polling process. There is no interference in the democratic process, right? In many countries around the world, there is interference. The government interferes. There is rigging of elections. There's overturning of legitimate results to maintain a dictator in democratic clothing, so to speak, etc. But this is predicated on a free and fair election, students. Please take note of this. So this can involve choosing leaders, making laws, and participating in other ways to shape their society, to shape your society. You as a citizen, to shape your society. So in a liberal democratic setting, students, the power rests in your hands. And I'm looking at you all right now. You are so powerful and you don't know it because you have, as a collective, the power to change the government. All of you sitting here today, you have the power to change the government. And if you're an international student, you have the power to change the government in your countries. That is liberal democracy that allows you that power over government. All right, so let's take a look at this one more time. It means democracy, it means rule by the citizens directly or through elected representatives. It's a system where citizens have the power to influence decisions. Please understand this point. Influence decisions through your representatives. And sometimes you can even influence decisions directly by writing letters, by protesting, by engaging in civil disobedience, right? Of course, it shouldn't be violent at any point in time. Influence decisions that affect citizens' lives, often through voting. This can involve choosing leaders. You choose the leaders, they go into office for a certain period of time, 4 or 5 years, in some cases 6 years. They perform or they don't perform. They are held accountable at the polls, and you have the right to say we need a new leader, or you have the right to say we want to maintain the same leader to move on for the next 5, 6, whatever the case may be. Making laws and participating in other ways to shape your society. So now let's bring the two concepts together. Liberal democracy, right? So to begin to understand the fuller picture here and to understand how that impacts governance. So liberal democracy is a political system We have many political systems, right? We have socialism, we have communism, right? We have, we talked about military and theocracy and monarchy and so forth, etc. This is one of the political systems out there that is practiced around the world. The United States, for example, is a liberal democracy. Canada, for example, it's a liberal democracy with liberties, individual liberties, and allowing people to ensure that their rights are respected in the Charter of Human Rights and to uphold those rights in the court of law. So, liberal democracy, students, it's a political system with democratic governance with liberal values, right? The liberal values. Now, we have talked about liberal values, which emphasize the rights, individual rights and freedom. Please take note, individual rights and freedom. If you have individual rights, then you have collective rights as well, as members of society, as citizens of that country. You have individual rights, the right to freedom of worship, the right to freedom of movement, for example, the right to shelter, for example, the right to associate with whomever you want, for example, or you like, the right to political association, to sustenance, economic sustenance, and so forth, etc., right to life, all of those things, right? So when we talk about individual rights, that's what we're talking about, students. All of you have those rights right now. Not you will have those rights. Once you're born into this society that practices this form of government and governance, students, you have those rights right away, automatically. There's no special ceremony that bestows those rights on you. It is bestowed the minute you're born. It begins. All right. So individual rights and freedoms, right? We just highlighted some of those rights and freedoms, movement, for example, worship, for example, association, for example, to shelter, for example, to life itself, for example, education and health, for example, in some countries, you pay for education. We are talking about, say, elementary school education, for example, which is the fundamental basis. Countries owe their citizens the very basic, if nothing at all, which in education and allowing even the poorest families to send their children to school without having to be burdened by the financial pressures. So in liberal democracy, citizens are free and they have fair elections, right? That means your vote counts, right? What does that mean, fair election? Your vote counts. It doesn't count twice, it counts once. In some countries, votes don't count, wishes count. And people are not elected, but they're selected. But in liberal democratic setting, your vote counts, students. And so you can go and vote and be sure that it counts, right? So free and fair election, and they are governed by the rule of law. The rule of law, what does that mean? We have talked about the rule of law. It means the law of the land rules. Doesn't matter who is involved. And you often had the term, the law is no respecter of person. And you see the symbol of the law, that it is blind, the law doesn't see, and anyone that runs afoul of the law must be subjected to the penalties prescribed by that law. That is the rule of law. So even the most powerful person and the least powerful person, they are both subjected to the same law. That's what it means, students. So please take note of this. They're governed by the rule of law, and there is separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary and the parliament. So let's put that here. So the executive as a branch of government, the judiciary as another branch of government, and the legislature as another branch of government. And all branches are, students, what? Let me cap this. Equal. Right? All branches are equal. They have to work together for the good of society. They are equal. They hold each other accountable, right? So the executive, right, enforces the law. The judiciary interprets the law, and the legislature makes the law. Please take note of this very critical distinction. in a liberal democratic setting, in democracies across the world. And those functions are very critical to maintaining the rule of law. And if the executive decides to encroach on the rights of the judiciary, there is constitutional crisis. Please take note, students. Constitutional crisis. When the executive, for example, doesn't follow the law and doesn't obey court orders, there is constitutional crisis. So liberal democracy, students, is marked by separation of powers, and all three branches are equal. Please take note of this very important point. And the protection of civil liberties and human rights, right? Civil liberties and human rights. The right to vote is a civil liberty. You have that liberty enshrined in the Constitution, and no one can take it away. And students, anytime somebody takes away that civil liberty, you have a case to win. If everything's working right, you have a case to win. And probably you have some monetary compensation as well along the way. So civil liberty and human rights are protected under the Constitution, in the case of Canada, under the Charter of Rights, and is protected and cannot be taken away from you. In this type of political system, there is equal protection under the law. So the poorest citizen has the same protection, right? We talk about not protection that the money can buy, but protection by the state. The poorest citizen has the same protection as the richest citizen. So if everything is working well, the state should protect all citizens equally. If something is happening in one community, regardless of the economic status of that community, the state should protect that community. If something is happening in the rich neighborhood, the state should protect the rich neighborhood as well. So this is liberal democracy, students. Liberalism, just to recap, just to ensure we understand this, because this is a key concept as we begin to talk about and make the distinctions between types of governments in the democratic environment. You have different types of democratic settings and so forth across the world. You have their socialism in certain ways, countries that practice socialism, but not entirely the whole concept of socialism. They are democratic in nature as well, but they have input and they have a role in the larger things of society like health and education, etc. So we need to understand the different aspects of liberal democracy. And it says here once again, liberalism refers to the belief of individual liberty, equality before the law, and limited intervention by the government in the economy and in personal lives. Democracy, we just said, it means rule by the people, you the citizens, you are in charge in the democratic setting, directly or indirectly, and indirectly through elected representatives. And it's a system where citizens have power and influence decisions. This is important. You influence decisions. And that's why citizens in a democratic country are so powerful, because they impact policies, they impact decisions that affect their lives. They tell the government, this is how we want the housing policy, for example, immigration policy, for example, economic policies, for example, policies that impact their social lives, for example, often through voting. The voting is the most powerful tool in a democratic setting. This can involve choosing leaders, making laws, and participating in other ways to shape society. Bringing the two concepts together, students, we say it's a political system. Liberal democracy is a political system with democratic governance, with liberal values, emphasizing individual rights and freedoms. In liberal democracy, therefore, citizens are free. Doesn't mean you can break the law. It doesn't mean that, students, you will be held accountable. You are free in terms of your actions within the law. You can. You can buy a house. You can sell a house. You can sell a car. You can buy a car. You can take trips as you can afford. You can go in and out of the country. In some countries, you need an exit visa to travel, telling the government where you're going, and the government dictating to you where you should go. In a liberal democracy, you have the right to leave the country. You owe no one an explanation. So citizens are free, and there are free and fair elections and the governance of the rule of law, and the separation of powers. We talked about the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. All of that, all of these arms and branches of government are co-equals. Please take note, co-equals, equal, in other words. And the protection of civil liberties and human rights. In this type of political system, we said all have equal protection under the law. So understand this concept. And as we begin to talk about the different types of governance systems in place, particularly within the democratic ecosystem, we want to understand what liberal democracy means. In our next discussion, we are going to try to distinguish this from other types of democratic governance may not have these characteristics that we just discussed.